Welcome to today's webinar, The Value of Kentucky's Public Libraries Using ROI to Explain Your Library's Impact. This live webinar is being presented by Dr. Brian Reel, Assistant Professor at the University of Kentucky School of Information Science. KDLA is supported by the Library Sciences and Technology Act, LSTA, and we thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for sponsorship of this webinar. I'm going to open up Dr. Reel's slide and he will begin our webinar. Thank you, Dr. Reel.
All right, thank you. I'm not seeing the chat lighting up or anything, so I assume you can hear me. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brian Reel. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Information Science at the University of Kentucky. I do work on public libraries and film and media archives as well. We'll just be talking about public libraries today. So I am not an economist, but I've worked with a few on this project. And some of you may have seen some of the findings from this earlier. We actually got to a point where we were getting near the end of this project and a new data set for fiscal year 2024 came out. So we rebooted this. This is the most recent data that we currently have. So just a bit about how we were supported for this project. KDLA approached me asking if I had thoughts on who could do a return on investment study for public libraries across Kentucky. I reached out to some folks who were able to help me out with that. Those are my partners over at Blueprint Kentucky, and I'll get to that in a moment. Another person on this project is Shannon Oltman, who was a professor here at the University of Kentucky. She is now with Wayne State University. Perhaps most importantly, though, we were funded through an IMLS subgrant that KDLA provided to us. That is how we were able to actually have the funding to do this project. And Blueprint Kentucky was our partner. They are an agricultural economic center here at the University of Kentucky. My partners on this were Dr. Allison Davis, who is the head of Blueprint, and Simona Balaz, who is their research coordinator and who did a lot of the data processing to make this possible. So jumping forward to perhaps the most important thing, here's the final product. We created county level profiles for every library in Kentucky on their return on investment, basically translating dollar amounts into. Sorry, I'm trying to, Trisha, if you could add the link to this to the chat, or folks following from home, if you just Google KDLA ROI, it should bring it up as well. All right, so we created this dashboard that you can see on the slide here. It is saying Jefferson County. That can drop down to any one of the counties in the state of Kentucky. And it's cut off here, but if you scroll down below, there's a link to a state level report, which is a long report where I explain calculations at the state level and did a good bit of writing for advocacy purposes, kind of explaining our process through how we created this data, but also some notes towards explaining this data towards stakeholders. You would be able to hand the state level report to somebody on your library board, and they would be able to understand a lot for advocacy purposes. And the same goes for local government, etc. If you are on the page for this dashboard, if you scroll down below what I have displayed here, there is the IMLS logo. And then there's this little box with an arrow pointing down. If you click that, you can download what you see on the page as a PDF. So that can be printed, it can be handed to local stakeholders, it can be simply emailed to somebody. So we want this data to be used for libraries' advocacy purposes. So you have this now. The rest of this presentation is basically going into how we created this data and some of the logic behind it. So the start of this was KDLA requested that we do something similar to a return on investment study that Texas did. And this is from 2017 out of the University of Texas at Austin. And it came out with basically $4.64 for every dollar invested. I'm going to, as a bit of a preview, say that we're a bit lower than that for a few reasons, and I want to set some expectations. So this is from a couple years ago, but a center called, or an advocacy group called United for Medical Research calculated that every dollar put into the National Institutes of Health returned $2.56 in economic activity. So $1 in, $2.56 in benefit. That's pretty great. And, you know, that's for medical research. That's saving lives. So that's kind of where a lot of these economic studies are landing in terms of the value range. And for the moment, our numbers are a bit lower than they have been in recent years. That this is actually a report from Publishers Weekly showing that library circulation stats services have been down post-COVID. That was a 2024 report, but our state level numbers and our national numbers are showing something of a reversal of that. Another issue is that we have a lot of new library innovations that data people have not figured out how to count things, or we have not included certain library programs and services in data surveys so that we have an easy way to process the numbers. And I'll get into that a bit more in a bit. And something that you should be prepared for is that rural library return on investment is generally lower than overall state averages and for larger library systems. That's because we're operating at different economies of scale. But I'll talk about that a bit more and how to actually use some of those lower numbers to your advantage when advocating for your library. So these are the main calculations, and I'll break these down a bit more in a bit, but we have the total of all library services translated into dollar amounts, the value of your circulating materials, what that means for people, value of reference services, the value of public programs, the value of computer and internet use. That all comes out to about, a bit over $500 million. And then we have the impact of expenditures. The library spends money, that money goes back into the community. People who work for a library go out, shop at local places and so on. So there's, even though that's mostly spending money, there is some benefit that the community receives. So we basically add the benefit the community receives from library expenditures and the value of services, subtract the total, and then divide by the total investment. So how much is actually spent to do everything. And that's where we get return on investment. So our return on investment calculation for the state of Kentucky for public libraries is $3.01. So going a bit more into, actually before I go on, I want to highlight some other numbers other than that $3.01. We have $550 million in library services, over $500 million. we have $494 million in net value after investment when everything is calculated. So that's $500 million of benefit that people across Kentucky receive. That translates to $107 in value per person that people receive across this state. Going into Kentucky demographics for just a moment, as most of you know, we are quite a rural state. 75% of all libraries in the state are classified by the National Center for Education Statistics as either being town or rural. And 93 cents of every dollar for public libraries across the state comes from local funding. That is compared to about 86 or 87 cents per dollar for the national average, which doesn't seem like that much of a difference, but it does make a significant impact on what libraries can do and afford. And something that's worth keeping in mind is, again, rural libraries have lower economies of scale. If there's less people in a community, that means less circulation per item purchased. Things like that drive down the return on investment. So let's get into the labor and operational impacts, because we have that beyond the value of actual services. So this is one of the areas that Blueprint Kentucky was very good at calculating. They use a software suite called Implan, which is partially software, partially database, that has calculations based on different communities and careers across the United States to figure out how much money goes back into the community from organizational spending. So I am going to read a quote that my colleague at Blueprint wrote to explain some of this. The direct effect of this is the straightforward value of library spending in its community through labor and salaries. The indirect effect is the estimated impact on the outside companies that provide essential products and services to Kentucky's public libraries. This spending supports jobs throughout the supply chain. The induced effect is the value created by the household spending of library employees and that of persons employed through the indirect effect of library operations. So again, this is how we get to the value of library spending and library employment on communities. On the value of library circulation services and so forth. ALA a few years back developed a library value calculator. And this is a lot of kind of common sense stuff. A book is circulated. What is the average price of an adult book? What's the average price of a YA book, a children's book, etc.? You can figure out market prices for those things that have direct market values. Meanwhile, we have other things that are kind of trickier to calculate. Like young adult programs are based partially on the value of a movie ticket or being able to do other things in a community. Computer usage is based on a calculation of using Wi-Fi someplace else and breaking down the hardware for that computer by an hour. So this is what we primarily use for our calculations, and I should note that this was last updated in 2009. So things have changed a good bit. There's not really a more universally accepted model than this right now. Part of why we stuck with this despite the age is that we want to be able to easily defend our calculations, and saying, hey, these are a bit out of date, these numbers are a little bit conservative, that's not a bad thing for our line of argumentation. And we also wanted an outside calculation because that's somewhat reliable. The fact that the library community has been using this calculator for years means that there is some trust behind it when making arguments for it. So, translating Kentucky's values, we have our circulation numbers, and we have the translated dollar amounts. So just circulation market value comes to $410 million and change. And something that was interesting when I was doing my research for this is a lot of other economic studies have kind of warned against calculating things in this way because of an argument of, well, libraries aren't just books and we don't just want to focus on circulation. Look at everything else that libraries are doing. And while there's some validity in that, it's worth pointing out when you do focus on, hey, we are still books, we are still circulating materials. Look at all that we're doing in the space and look at what's now happening in the ebook space and so on. It really does show your library in a positive light. That as much as we're trying to say we're not just books and so forth, saying we are still books shows your value. And then we have this. So as I mentioned, we are basing our data off of what each library submitted for the annual data report that Kentucky collects and then reports upwards to IMLS for their public library survey. There is what we call in the spreadsheet Section M, which allows libraries to enter different services that do not have a direct line for enter this number for this thing. So we have things like seed library. We have bicycles, renting out fishing poles and tackle, but other things that probably will be included in the survey directly in the coming years, like Wi-Fi hotspots are in here rather than being a directly calculated circulation number. And we did not include this in the calculations that you'll see on the dashboard for each individual county. This is a limitation. When using what's on the dashboard for advocacy purposes, you should feel free to note this limitation, that it's just kind of messy enough that we wanted each county to still be comparable. And by kind of picking out what each county voluntarily entered, we would have messed that up. Plus, we don't necessarily have easy to do calculations for some of these services. Like there is not a standard accepted dollar amount for what notary services are worth in a library, or those fishing poles and bicycles. I'm pointing this out too because as Kentucky and IMLS, or as KDLA and IMLS start to add new things to the survey, we want to be able to replicate this study in the future and be able to update our data. If we have new questions asking you for new things, it's going to be partially for that purpose, that we will be able to do these sorts of calculations in the future, even if we don't have them now. But when speaking to your stakeholders, be sure to say, we're calculated at our ROI for this dollar amount, but this isn't even counting all these other cool, new, innovative things that we're doing. So going back to the calculations that we did do, we have a large over 1 million items that were delivered through bookmobiles, and following the ALA modeling, we added what is effectively a delivery fee that is close to the market value of shipping. And similarly, we have interlibrary loan, which is counted as a higher amount due to the labor involved in librarians finding these items that are often harder to get, and the additional value of items that are often out of print or hard to get in a local area, plus the shipping on top of that. So something we don't have counted is in-house circulation. Things like how often does somebody come into a library and read a magazine or read a newspaper? And we did some rough estimates based on that. And frankly, I think that these are somewhat conservative because they count things like newspapers and magazines. They don't count things like books. And this is something that's tricky because I know that some library ILS systems have the ability to count in-house use. So that is counted for some libraries, not others. We wanted a fairly conservative estimate for that, but this is an estimate. It's one of the few things that we don't have a firm number that we're using for calculation. And then we have public programming, which provides considerable value to the state. And I should note that this is up over, since we did 2 data sets with this. We started with fiscal year 2023, and then we completely rebooted the project with fiscal year 2024. The numbers went up considerably. And as we're coming out of COVID, as people are kind of rediscovering public libraries, we're expecting these numbers to go up a bit more. Something else that's worth noting historically is that public library usage, and especially usage of public library programs, goes up during times of economic uncertainty and outright economic downturns. So to be continued, but I'm expecting these numbers and this impact to go up in the coming years. We have computer usage and Wi-Fi sessions. This is one of the things that when sharing the data that we have, I think is important to focus on. We have about 5 million people in the state. We have more Wi-Fi sessions than we have people, along with considerable computer usage, which anybody who's been around for a couple decades knows has dropped considerably from the 90s and early 2000s, but it's still important. And the most recent data that we have, not just for libraries, but for state level, 16.1% of households in Kentucky do not have Wi-Fi or have no internet at all. So 16.1% of households in Kentucky have no internet. Another 13% only have cell connections. So we're talking about almost 30% of households in Kentucky not having strong and reliable internet. Pointing out the computer usage and Wi-Fi sessions is important since many people making legislative decisions are not facing these inequities personally. So try to highlight this and highlight who is actually using your services beyond just the dollar value. So database searches, we had 2 different models that have been used before for this. One is put a value on every search. The other is put a value on every article download. We went and we picked one of the 2 because these are overlapping concepts that with those searches, often you end up with the download. The reason that we went with the search figure is that very often data can be found without having to fully download an article, just by reading abstracts and getting other information. So that seemed like a more honest way to present things. Now, reference. This is one of the interesting areas for what's happening in library services these days. We use the ALA number of $7 per question which combines the labor time and the value of whatever materials are used for answering a question. However, more research needs to be done on how much time people are spending with reference these days, how much they are actually using reference materials purchased by the library rather than web searches, things like that. We don't really have good modeling on reference, and that might be a future project for me. The other thing worth noting, though, is that we are seeing radical swings in how libraries are reporting reference. That I'm seeing some libraries that have very close to almost as many reference questions as there are people in their county. And I'm seeing libraries that are reporting just a couple thousand reference questions for a year when they had hundreds of thousands of people enter their library. So this is something that needs to be worked on. And I'm on a data advisory committee with IMLS. They've noticed this overall for the public library survey, that even though we're doing new and innovative services like social work in public libraries or social work like services, in a lot of places, those new and innovative interactions are not being counted in any way when they could be counted as reference. So this is something to keep an eye on. If your reference questions for your library are low, think about how you can properly count that, because with the data I'm seeing, I do believe that reference is being considerably undercounted across most libraries in the state. And then volunteers. This was an interesting thing. We were replicating the study out of Texas, and apparently Texas has a culture of heavily using volunteers in their libraries. And their numbers on volunteers were so high that it boosted their overall return on investment. Because the thing about library staff, paid staff, is that we do a calculation of, for that benefit, first it's a loss because you have to pay the employee, that is a cost to the library, but then there is a slight benefit that the community receives from that employee spending money, buying groceries, doing whatever else in their community, figuring out averages for that. Volunteers are a pure benefit, that it is fairly standard for return on investment studies to count their labor time and what would be the equivalent of not just labor but benefits, which is why it's a high number. We're going by an average that was determined by the state of Kentucky. So that is a pure benefit added. In the past, KDLA has not collected data on volunteers because that's not in the IMLS national survey. To fill this out for our study, I launched a quick survey that some of you may have seen asking about volunteers in your libraries. I got responses from about 2/3 of the libraries across the state. And in the future, we'll have better data for this because KDLA has now added this as a question for the state level survey. So those are the main calculations, and I just want to go back. This is how we arrived at everything. Again, we have a $3.01 return on investment for public libraries across the state of Kentucky. And we have a range that's a low of almost $2 to considerably higher $7 or $8 for different counties across the state. And this again is looking at what we are putting out for each county. How I mentioned, you can download a PDF at the bottom of the page for the dashboard. This is an example of one of those PDFs. This can just be printed out or emailed to somebody. And we were asked to do calculations based on dollar amounts, but when we were figuring out ways to organize this data, we decided to put the raw numbers too, because beyond just the ROI, this should be used just to show off some contrast. Like we have, this is Jefferson County. We can see 772,000 people in the county. We had 1.76 million library visits. That's more than 2 visits per person in the county. That's a good number when you have some people who think that libraries might not be being used much. And then we had more than 5 items circulated per person. Showing off numbers and showing off contrast in a list like that is a strong argument for library value. And where you see the market values here for the different dollars amount, those are dynamic. Those show up differently based on what the top 5 services were for different libraries. So it might change from one county to another. And again, this is free to use. It's easy to download. And we do hope to be updating this in the future. But right now, this is using fiscal year 2024 data. That's basically all I have. But I say it's all I have. We have the dashboard and we have my rather long report that is at the bottom of the dashboard page that you can download for more information. But for now, I would very gladly take questions. All right, so there we go. So Maura, we don't have a table and data set that shows all the counties at once at the moment. We may put that out in the future. So a part of why there's some hesitancy on doing that, though, is what I mentioned with some of the rural counties having a lower return on investment. We don't want comparison that heavily because if you see it laid out like that, if you have a rural county that has, $1.70 as their ROI versus like going back, Jefferson County with Louisville is at $5.83. That kind of leads to a quick question of why is this rural area so much lower? And there is a very good answer to that. That this rural county is offering services that can't be found elsewhere that are highly valuable and that are more difficult to provide at scale. But the comparison can be somewhat misleading, so we're hesitant to do that, but we haven't closed the door to doing that at some point in the coming months. All right. Do we have any other questions?
I was just going to say thank you, Dr. Real, and I wanted to just chat for a minute in hopes that other people may also have questions or things that they want to share. But please feel free to unmute if you'd like to ask a question or if you'd like to see another slide again to go back to. This has been very informative and very helpful. There's a lot of interesting information, and I know several people on the webinar right now are from public libraries as well as staff from across the state from KDLA. So if anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to share. Also, a couple other things while people are thinking that through. Today's webinar has been recorded and it will be available in the online learning portal as well as on our YouTube channel if you'd like to share it with colleagues or to encourage other people to watch to hear about the ROI study.
Yep. And while we wait and give it a few more moments just to make sure that there aren't any last questions, something that I went over a little faster than I intended that I think is worth mentioning for thinking through using this for advocacy purposes, talking about the limitations, and especially talking about some of the things happening in rural areas. So as I mentioned, we're using kind of older calculations by ALA, and we didn't want to cherry pick and change some of these. Um, like an exception is they had, for some reason, they had round dollar amounts, but for audiobooks, they had $9.95. All right, that we changed to $10 even because everything else was. But if you look at videos, $4 when you obviously can't buy a DVD or Blu-ray for $4 in most cases, unless it's a truly bad movie. But ALA calculated that as $4 back in 2009 because that was a typical rental at Blockbuster or Redbox. So while most market values, like for a book, is the actual print price of a book, video was lower because there was a reasonable market substitution for a rental in most communities. Now, Blockbuster doesn't exist, Redbox doesn't exist. We also still have, despite streaming having taken over, well over 3 million video checkouts in a year with a population of about 5 million. So when talking about what's actually happening in your community, acknowledge the limitation to our data on this calculation for this being a lower price, but also that in communities where somebody either can't get good internet access that is robust enough for streaming, or they simply can't afford it or choose not to get it, this is still a valuable service being offered by libraries that isn't being offered elsewhere. And that is kind of the key to talking about these data. It's bringing up what the library is actually offering, using the dollar amounts as kind of a starting point, but then using that for storytelling about what this actually means to patrons. That when talking about things like computer usage, what it means when a family has cell phone internet at home, but they don't actually have a computer, or maybe they even have proper broadband internet, but that's being used for streaming services. There might be one computer. It's streaming services, phones, whatever else. Or you have multiple children who need to complete homework projects. The house has one computer, your library has several. So we have those dollar amounts for the computer usages and so on. What that actually means for users, though, in a era when we just kind of assume that everybody has internet and proper technology at home, that actually means a lot. It means a lot for people who are overlooked otherwise. So let's go back to, what slide was that? How to get things for your own county. So Sarah, above, there was a link for the KDLA ROI page that you can also just find by Googling KDLA ROI. And then you'll see kind of in this upper corner here, this nice little drop box that is for each county. It starts by default saying state. And that is the calculation for the entire state of Kentucky. It would have been a programming mess to make it say state population instead of county population, so that stayed. But for every county, the county population is correct. And you get that contrast and can easily download. And yeah, and Caleb, your mention of the comparison to how many people are actually going to basketball games compared to actually using libraries is phenomenal. People don't realize just how popular libraries are. And again, we have program attendance that often is close to the overall county population, and circulation is almost always a multiple. Sarah, going back to the question of downloading each of these county profiles as a PDF. Yeah, so unfortunately I cut this off, and I don't want to do the mess of trying to load up a web page and scroll through while doing this presentation. But if you scroll down, if you look for the IMLS logo further down on the right side, there's this little square with a downward pointing arrow kind of icon. If you click that, you get your option for multiple downloads, and that includes PDF, which is my preferred format, but you can also do it as a PowerPoint slide, or you can do it as an image. And then near the bottom of the page too, there is a link for the state level report. And again, I was the primary author on that. That is about 30 pages of explaining the methodology and talking about different services and so on, some of our limitations and all of that. We are trying to be completely transparent, but we also wrote with an eye towards advocacy and thinking about what information we want to provide so that you can do the best in advocating for your library.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wheel. We really appreciate your participation and your expertise and all of the work that went into collecting this data and analyzing and synthesizing it into something that we can all use in each of our counties. So we very much appreciate that. I just wanted to give a quick reminder that the materials for today, a copy of the PowerPoint is available under the PDFs and slides link on the Blackboard Learn window when you close out of the Collaborate meeting. There is a brief, just a couple question survey for the webinar today, and I'll drop that in the chat, as well as it'll be in the email confirmation for everybody that attended. Certificates of attendance will be available in your online learning portal account within about a week of the program, and the recording will be available for anyone who would like to receive the content in the future. That'll also be available in about a week. And KDLA is supported by the Library Sciences and Technology Act, and we thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for sponsorship of the webinar. Thank you all for attending today's program.
All right, thank you. And as a quick note, Sarah French made a very good comment in the chat that I think says some of what I've been saying a bit more eloquently, and the state level report goes into, if you're seeing some of the inequities between the calculations for rural libraries and more calculated areas, there's a way to spin that, not even spin, to accurately say that rural libraries have this essential impact for their communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Reel.
All right.